Kanye West had always been known for his unpredictable antics, but this time he was on a mission. The idea struck him in the middle of a heated conversation about social justice and police treatment of the homeless. He had heard stories, seen viral videos, and read countless reports about the way unhoused individuals were treated by law enforcement. But Kanye didn't want secondhand knowledge, he wanted to experience it firsthand. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. So, in the dead of night, he went through his wardrobe, but none of his designer clothes would do. Instead, he paid a visit to a Hollywood costume designer and had an unrecognizable disguise crafted. He donned tattered clothes that reeked of neglect, scuffed shoes with holes in them, and a battered beanie that concealed most of his face. His transformation was impeccable. When he looked in the mirror, Kanye West no longer stared back. In his place was a man who looked like he had been beaten down by life, a ghost of someone society had long since discarded. With the disguise in place, he stepped out onto the streets of Los Angeles, his heart pounding with nervous anticipation. The streets smelled of exhaust fumes, stale beer, and desperation. The neon lights flickered, and the distant sound of sirens punctuated the air. It was a world he had never truly belonged to, but was now attempting to immerse himself in. He slumped against a bench, observing the passers-by. Some avoided eye contact, others walked past without a second glance, and a few whispered among themselves as if he didn't exist. The real test, however, was the police. It didn't take long for him to attract attention. A group of officers patrolling the area had spotted him from a distance. Kanye made sure to act the part, slouching, muttering to himself, and rummaging through a trash can as if searching for food. He felt their eyes on him before he heard the heavy footsteps approaching. "Hey, move along!" one of the officers barked. Kanye hesitated. I'm just trying to find something to eat," he stammered, keeping his voice low and hoarse. The officers exchanged glances. One of them stepped closer, gripping his baton. "I said move along. We don't want people like you hanging around here." People like you! The words stung, even though Kanye knew he wasn't really part of the demographic being dismissed. Still, he felt the weight of what so many endured daily. "I got nowhere else to go," he said, his voice shaking, but not from fear, from anger. One of the officers scoffed. "Not my problem." Then, without warning, the situation escalated. One of the officers shoved him hard. Kanye stumbled, catching himself before he hit the pavement. His heart pounded, not out of fear, but rage. He wanted to scream, wanted to rip off his disguise and call them out, but he forced himself to stay in character. He had come here to learn, to witness. A bystander, a young woman holding a phone, began recording. Kanye saw her out of the corner of his eye. The officers noticed her too. Their demeanor shifted, their aggression cooling ever so slightly. "Come on, get lost before we book you for loitering," the lead officer grumbled, backing off just enough to give Kanye an exit. He shuffled away, his heart racing. He had seen enough for one night. Later, he sat in his car, back in his real clothes, shaking from what he had just experienced. It was one thing to read about it, to hear about it, but to live it, even briefly, it was horrifying. He knew he had to do something. The next morning, Kanye took to social media, dropping a bombshell that sent shockwaves across the internet. "I went undercover as a homeless man in LA. What I saw changed me forever. Video coming soon." The post exploded within minutes. Fans, celebrities, activists, and news outlets all clamored for more details. Some doubted him, others praised him. Then he dropped the footage. The world watched as a disguised Kanye West, one of the most famous men alive, was shoved and dismissed like trash. The clip went viral. News anchors debated it. Talk show hosts dissected it. Police officials scrambled to respond. Within days, protests erupted across the city, demanding reform and accountability. The officers involved were placed on leave pending investigation. The LAPD issued a statement, but it wasn't enough to quell the growing anger. Kanye, never one to stay silent, took it a step further. He announced the launch of an initiative aimed at providing housing and resources for the homeless. He pledged millions of his own money to fund shelters, job training programs, and legal assistance for those affected by police mistreatment. The conversation had been started, and this time it wasn't fading into the background. Kanye West had done what few could. He forced the world to look, to care. And for those who had long been ignored, it felt like someone had finally heard their voices. The firestorm of attention that followed Kanye West's revelation only intensified as the days went on. The media cycle, which was often fickle and quick to move on, couldn't let go of the story. The video of Kanye being shoved by police officers was played on major networks, dissected by social justice organizations, and even sparked heated debates among politicians. Some praised Kanye for his bravery, calling his social experiment a much-needed wake-up call for the nation. Others accused him of grandstanding, claiming that he was using the plight of the homeless for publicity. The police department, meanwhile, scrambled to contain the fallout. The officers involved were suspended pending an internal review, but the damage had already been done. Kanye didn't stop there. He called a press conference outside Los Angeles City Hall, standing alongside prominent civil rights leaders, activists, and even formerly homeless individuals. Wearing a simple hoodie and jeans, far from his usual extravagant fashion, he stepped up to the microphone. "People talk about the homeless problem like it's just a statistic," he said, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "But these are human beings, they're not invisible, and they shouldn't be treated like they don't matter. I spent one night on the streets and saw things that broke me. Imagine what it's like for the people who live like that every day." The crowd erupted in applause. Cameras flashed. But Kanye wasn't here to bask in the moment. He had a plan. He unveiled the Project Donda Haven initiative, a multi-million-dollar program designed to tackle homelessness in a way no one had before. The initiative would focus on building affordable housing units, providing mental health services, and creating job training centers specifically tailored to help unhoused individuals reintegrate into society. "We don't just need shelters, we need solutions," Kanye declared. "We need to help people get back on their feet permanently." The announcement was met with widespread support. Billionaires, celebrities, and major companies pledged donations. Elon Musk offered to provide funding for sustainable housing projects, while Jay-Z promised a series of benefit concerts to raise awareness. Even government officials, previously slow to address the crisis, had no choice but to take notice. But not everyone was happy about Kanye's activism. Behind the scenes, there were powerful forces that thrived on the status quo. Developers who benefited from gentrification, corrupt politicians who ignored the crisis for years, and even members of the police force who resented the public backlash. Kanye had stirred a pot that many wanted to keep untouched. Anonymous threats began pouring in. His team received messages warning him to stop pushing the issue. Tabloids suddenly ran hit pieces about him, twisting his words, trying to paint him as a reckless celebrity meddling in things he didn't understand. But Kanye wasn't backing down. One evening, as he was leaving a meeting with city officials about securing land for his housing project, a black SUV with tinted windows followed his car for miles. His security team noticed it immediately. When they made a series of turns, the SUV followed. "Yeah, we need to take precautions," his bodyguard said, gripping the wheel tightly. Kanye knew he had pissed off the wrong people. But instead of fear, he felt something else, determination. "Let them come," he said. "I'm not stopping." Despite the intimidation, Project Donda Haven moved forward. Kanye partnered with architects to design housing complexes that were not just shelters, but actual homes with dignity, spacious, solar-powered, and integrated with community gardens and recreational spaces. The first project broke ground in South Los Angeles, a place that had seen homelessness skyrocket in recent years. But then came another twist. Just weeks after his initiative was announced, Kanye was served with a cease and desist order from a group of city developers. The claim? That the land he had secured for the housing units was under dispute, and that he had no right to build on it. It was a thinly veiled attempt to shut him down. Instead of backing off, Kanye went public. He blasted the corruption on social media, posting documents, names, and details about the people trying to stop him. The internet erupted. Protesters swarmed City Hall. Hashtags like #LetYouBuild and #DondaHavenNow trended worldwide. Faced with overwhelming public pressure, the developers backed off. The project was back on, but Kanye knew this was just the beginning. The deeper he went into the fight against homelessness, the more corruption he uncovered. Millions of dollars allocated for homeless services had mysteriously disappeared over the years. Shelters were overcrowded and underfunded despite the state's massive budget. Politicians made promises, but nothing ever changed. Fueled by what he had learned, Kanye announced a documentary, Invisible No More, a raw, unfiltered look at the reality of homelessness in America. He hired investigative journalists, filmmakers, and experts to expose the truth. The documentary featured real stories: people who had lost their homes due to predatory landlords, veterans suffering from PTSD abandoned by the system, single mothers forced to sleep in cars with their children, and then came the biggest bombshell. A whistleblower from within the Los Angeles government came forward with leaked documents showing that several high-ranking officials had been funneling money meant for homeless relief into private real estate projects. The scandal exploded, leading to multiple resignations and criminal investigations. Kanye had done what no one else could. He had forced accountability. Months passed, and the first Donda Haven housing complex finally opened its doors. Families who had spent years on the streets now had a place to call home. Kanye stood at the entrance, watching as children ran through the halls, laughter replacing the sorrow that once filled their lives. A reporter approached him. "Mr. West, you started this journey by disguising yourself as a homeless man. Now standing here seeing these homes built, how do you feel?" Kanye looked around, taking it all in. He exhaled, a rare moment of vulnerability in his usually unshakable persona. "I feel like I finally did something that matters." Kanye West's mission had transformed from an undercover experiment into a full-blown movement. What had begun as an investigation into police treatment of the homeless had evolved into a crusade for justice, housing reform, and government accountability. Yet, despite his victories, the road ahead remained filled with obstacles. The backlash intensified. While some saw him as a hero, others saw him as a disruptor, a celebrity who had wandered into an issue far more complex than he understood. Political analysts debated his role on television, questioning whether his efforts were sustainable or just another passing phase in his unpredictable career. City officials, forced into damage control mode, dismissed him as an outsider stirring up chaos without offering real policy solutions. But Kanye had real solutions. As Project Donda Haven expanded, he hired a team of experts, urban planners, sociologists, and economists, to design a scalable housing model that could be replicated in cities across the country. He funded research into innovative housing solutions, including 3D-printed homes, eco-friendly microhousing, and modular communities designed to be both cost-effective and dignified. With each new project, Kanye West's influence grew. Yet, with that influence came new enemies. Several corporations, particularly those with interests in luxury developments, saw Kanye's affordable housing initiatives as a direct threat to their business. Developers who had been profiting off gentrification now found their plans obstructed by a movement that refused to be ignored. The attacks became more aggressive. A prominent newspaper published a scathing expose digging into Kanye's past controversies, attempting to discredit him. Anonymous sources claimed he had no real understanding of homelessness, that he was just a rich man playing savior. Kanye, never one to let criticism go unanswered, responded with unfiltered candor. "People are mad at me for trying to help. Where were they when the streets were full of people with nowhere to go? Where were they when kids were sleeping under bridges? Don't come at me with noise when I'm out here doing something real." His words struck a nerve. Activists rallied behind him. Celebrities who had once hesitated now openly supported his initiative. Donations flooded in, allowing Project Donda Haven to expand beyond Los Angeles. Plans were drawn up for housing projects in New York, Chicago, Atlanta, and Houston. But then came the biggest test yet. A major political figure, a well-known senator with ties to real estate lobbyists, publicly denounced Kanye's initiative, claiming it was unsustainable and unrealistic. He pushed for legislation that would tighten restrictions on privately funded housing developments, a clear attempt to stifle Kanye's progress. Instead of backing down, Kanye did what he did best. He took the fight directly to the people. He organized a televised town hall, inviting not just politicians, but real people affected by homelessness. Formerly unhoused individuals shared their stories. Mothers who had regained custody of their children after finding stable housing spoke about how the system had failed them. The nation listened. Viewership skyrocketed. Hashtags trended worldwide. Even those who had been skeptical of Kanye's approach began to acknowledge that he was forcing a conversation that had been ignored for too long. The political backlash didn't end there. Mysterious audits were launched against Kanye's businesses. City officials suddenly found zoning issues with his housing projects. His bank accounts were flagged for irregular transactions, delaying funding transfers for his initiatives. It was a coordinated attack, an attempt to strangle his efforts with bureaucracy. But Kanye, ever resilient, had anticipated resistance. He partnered with legal experts and anti-corruption watchdogs to fight back. His lawyers exposed the political motivations behind the audits, turning the tables on those who had tried to silence him. The pressure mounted until even the senator who had opposed him was forced to backpedal. By the time the dust settled, Kanye West had won again. Yet, despite the victories, he couldn't ignore the toll the battle had taken on him. The stress, the threats, the never-ending scrutiny, it all weighed on him. His team saw it. His closest friends worried about him. For the first time in a long time, he questioned whether he had the strength to keep going. One night, he found himself driving through the streets of Los Angeles alone. He passed by the very spots where he had first gone undercover, where he had seen the brutality of the system firsthand. He pulled over near Skid Row. There, in the quiet of the night, he saw a familiar face, an elderly homeless man he had met during his undercover experience. The man was sitting on the curb, staring up at the stars, humming to himself. Kanye approached him. "Hey man, you remember me?" The old man squinted, then chuckled. "You're that rapper, right? The one who dressed like us for a night?" Kanye smiled. "Yeah, that was me." The man nodded, then patted the empty spot beside him. Kanye sat down. For a while they just sat there in silence. Then the old man spoke. "You did something most people wouldn't. You saw us, really saw us. That means something." Kanye exhaled. "I don't know if I'm making a real difference. Feels like every time I fix something, more people try to tear it down." The man chuckled. "Change ain't easy, son, but you keep going. You ain't doing this for the cameras. You're doing it for the people who got nothing left. That's what matters." Kanye sat with those words for a long time. By the time he got back to his car, something inside him had shifted. The next morning, he called his team. "We're going bigger," he said. "We're taking this national." And with that, the next phase of Project Donda Haven was born. This wasn't just about Los Angeles anymore. Kanye West was ready to change the entire country. His next step? Taking the fight to Washington. A few months later, Kanye stood in the U.S. Capitol, meeting with lawmakers, pushing for policy changes that would prioritize affordable housing and mental health support for the homeless. He wasn't just building homes. He was fighting to change the laws that had allowed the crisis to spiral out of control in the first place. Some politicians dismissed him, others listened. But one thing was clear. Kanye West was no longer just a musician, a designer, or a celebrity. He had become a force for change, one that couldn't be ignored. And no matter how many people tried to stop him, he wasn't going anywhere. As Kanye West's influence in the fight against homelessness expanded, so did the scale of his ambitions. No longer content with building housing on a city-by-city basis, he began lobbying for sweeping legislative changes. He proposed a national initiative, one that would redirect federal funds from ineffective homeless shelters into long-term, sustainable housing projects with built-in support services. To gain traction, he orchestrated something that had never been done before: the Donda Haven National Summit on Housing Reform. Held in Washington, D.C., the event brought together politicians, economists, activists, and even formerly homeless individuals who had benefited from Project Donda Haven. The summit was a spectacle, but not in the way of a Hollywood red carpet or a lavish Kanye album release. Instead, it was raw, unfiltered, and filled with emotion. One of the most powerful moments came when a single mother took the stage, holding her young daughter's hand. She had lived in her car for nearly 2 years before moving into a Donda Haven complex. Through the program, she had not only found a home, but had also received career training and mental health support. "I was invisible," she told the crowd, her voice shaking. "People walked past me like I didn't exist. But thanks to this program, my daughter doesn't have to grow up on the streets." The room erupted in applause. Even some of the politicians who had been skeptical of Kanye's approach seemed visibly moved. Meanwhile, opposition forces continued working in the shadows. Lobbyists for major real estate developers quietly met with lawmakers, urging them to resist Kanye's policies. The message was clear. If the government made housing more accessible, the real estate market would suffer. But Kanye had another card to play. Rather than relying solely on government support, he began leveraging blockchain technology to create a crowd-funded housing initiative. Using smart contracts and decentralized finance DeFi platforms, he allowed individuals to invest in affordable housing developments in exchange for a share of future rental profits. It was a revolutionary idea, one that could bypass traditional financial gatekeepers and put the power of housing development in the hands of the people. The idea took off. Within weeks, major tech investors joined the initiative. Cities struggling with homelessness began expressing interest. Even international organizations reached out, hoping to replicate the model in struggling communities across the globe. But Kanye wasn't looking for personal gain. He made a bold declaration. Every penny of profit from the Donda Haven blockchain initiative would be reinvested into building more homes. His approach was unconventional, but it was working. By the end of the year, the number of newly housed individuals from Project Donda Haven had surpassed 50,000. The movement was unstoppable. And as Kanye stood on a newly constructed rooftop in Los Angeles, looking out at a city he had fought to change, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about a social experiment anymore. This was a revolution, and he was just getting started. Kanye West's revolution in tackling homelessness had reached an unprecedented level. What had begun as an experiment in disguise had turned into a nationwide movement that threatened to upend the status quo. But the fight wasn't over. Even with thousands of people housed and millions of dollars being funneled into Project Donda Haven, there were still systemic barriers that stood in the way of long-term solutions. Bureaucratic red tape, zoning laws, and entrenched financial interests continued to hinder his efforts. For every step forward, the opposition, wealthy developers, corrupt politicians, and corporate lobbyists pushed back harder. Kanye realized that real change couldn't happen without shaking up the system itself. Housing projects were critical, but they weren't enough if unjust policies remained in place. So he took his fight straight to Congress. He pushed for the Donda Housing Reform Act, a bill designed to 1. Redirect government funds from ineffective emergency shelters to long-term affordable housing. 2. Cut unnecessary zoning restrictions that made it nearly impossible for affordable housing projects to be built in urban centers. 3. Provide federal grants to cities willing to implement sustainable and community-focused housing solutions. 4. Increase accountability by mandating transparent audits on government spending related to homelessness. But getting a bill passed was easier said than done. Opponents tried to dismiss Kanye as just another celebrity dabbling in politics. "What does a rapper know about housing policy?" one senator scoffed on national television. Kanye responded swiftly and unapologetically. "I don't need a political degree to see that people are dying in the streets while you sit in your offices doing nothing," he fired back in a fiery interview. "I don't need permission to care, and I damn sure don't need permission to act." His words resonated with millions. Protesters took to the streets in Washington, D.C., demanding the passage of the bill. Kanye leveraged his massive influence, calling on celebrities, business leaders, and everyday Americans to pressure lawmakers. The bill, once dismissed as a long shot, started gaining real traction. Then came another unexpected turn. As Kanye continued his push for housing reform, tensions escalated. One evening, as he left a private meeting in New York City, an unidentified man rushed toward his security team, reaching into his coat. Gunfire erupted. Kanye was immediately shielded by his security detail, who tackled him into an armored SUV as shots rang out. The attacker was subdued, and miraculously, no one was hurt. But the message was clear. Someone wanted him silenced. The media exploded. Conspiracy theories ran rampant. Was it a random act of violence, or something more sinister? Kanye didn't let it slow him down. In a speech just days later, he addressed the incident head-on. "You can try to scare me. You can try to stop me. But this isn't about me. This is about millions of people who deserve better. And I will not stop." The crowd erupted in applause. The incident only fueled the movement further. International leaders began reaching out, inspired by Kanye's vision. Countries dealing with their own housing crises, Brazil, South Africa, India, wanted to collaborate with Donda Haven to implement similar solutions. Seeing an opportunity to take the initiative worldwide, Kanye announced Donda Haven Global, an international expansion aimed at tackling homelessness in developing nations. The first project, building sustainable housing communities in war-torn regions where displaced families had nowhere to go, Tech billionaires, philanthropists, and global organizations threw their support behind the initiative. Even the United Nations acknowledged Kanye's efforts, inviting him to speak at their annual summit on humanitarian issues. Standing before world leaders, Kanye delivered one of the most powerful speeches of his life. The world doesn't need more billion-dollar skyscrapers. It needs homes. It needs dignity. And it needs people willing to fight for those who have nothing. If our governments won't lead the way, then we will. His words sent shockwaves across the globe. Back in the United States, the pressure to pass the Donda Housing Reform Act reached a boiling point. The bill had support, but corporate lobbyists were working overtime to stall it in committee hearings, ensuring it never reached a vote. Kanye wasn't going to let that happen. He launched the People's March for Housing, bringing together over 500,000 protesters in Washington, D.C., one of the largest demonstrations in U.S. history. For 3 days, people camped outside the Capitol, refusing to leave until lawmakers took action. The pressure was too much to ignore. In a dramatic late-night session, Congress finally voted. The result? The Donda Housing Reform Act passed. The victory was historic. The bill's passage meant billions of dollars would now be redirected to real solutions. Cities would be required to build sustainable housing instead of relying on temporary shelters. Corrupt zoning laws were overhauled. And most importantly, thousands, potentially millions of people would finally have a chance at a real home. As Kanye watched the announcement on live television, surrounded by his team, tears welled in his eyes. This wasn't about politics. This wasn't about fame. This was about people, and they had won. With the bill passed and Project Donda Haven thriving, Kanye could have stepped back. But he didn't. Instead, he doubled down, launching an initiative to provide free mental health services in every Donda Haven community. He worked with universities to develop educational programs that helped unhoused individuals learn new skills and re-enter the workforce. Years later, as he walked through one of the communities he helped build, a young boy ran up to him. "Mr. Kanye!" the boy shouted. "My mom says we live here because of you!" Kanye knelt down, smiling. "Nah, little man. You live here because people cared enough to make it happen." The boy grinned, then asked, "Are you going to build more?" Kanye laughed. "What do you think?" The boy nodded eagerly. "Yeah!" And with that, Kanye stood up, looking out at the thriving neighborhood he had helped create. This wasn't just about a moment. It was a movement. And he was never going to stop. Kanye West had done the unthinkable. He had not only exposed the mistreatment of the homeless, but he had also transformed the conversation into a national and global movement for change. His initiative had altered the landscape of housing reform, forcing governments and corporations to address a crisis they had long ignored. But despite the success, Kanye knew one hard truth: the fight was never truly over. Even with the Donda Housing Reform Act in place, challenges persisted. The bill's passage was only the beginning. Implementation was slow, and some cities, particularly those controlled by real estate interests, deliberately stalled progress, refusing to allocate the new federal funds to housing projects. Some politicians who had voted in favor of the act now hesitated, facing pressure from lobbyists. Kanye had expected this. He had learned through experience that systemic change wasn't a single victory, but a continuous battle. So rather than celebrating and stepping away, he increased his efforts. He established Donda Watch, a watchdog organization dedicated to ensuring government compliance with the new policies. The organization employed investigative journalists, legal experts, and housing advocates to track funding, report misuse, and expose corruption. It didn't take long for their work to bear fruit. Within 6 months, Donda Watch uncovered multiple cases of fraud, where state officials were diverting housing funds into unrelated projects. One city was using the money meant for affordable housing to build luxury condos. Another had allocated it to consulting fees that mysteriously led back to private developers. Kanye took the fight straight to the people. Instead of dealing with lawsuits or behind-the-scenes negotiations, he did what he did best. He made it public. He released a mini-documentary exposing the corruption, detailing where every dollar was supposed to go versus where it actually went. The response was immediate and explosive. Protests erupted in the cities caught mishandling the funds. State legislators were forced to step in. Some mayors resigned in disgrace. Kanye wasn't just fixing the problem, he was holding everyone accountable. But amidst the political battles, Kanye never lost sight of the human side of his mission. He made it a point to personally visit every Donda Haven community. He talked with residents, listened to their stories, and made sure they were receiving the resources they needed. At one site, he met a former foster youth who had been homeless since the age of 18. Now, with stable housing and a job training program, he was working towards becoming a mechanic. "Man, I used to sleep in an abandoned car," the young man told Kanye. "Now I'm learning how to fix them." Kanye smiled. That's what this is all about. Even as critics continued to question him, even as new roadblocks arose, Kanye remained relentless. This wasn't a stunt. It wasn't a phase. It was a movement. And Kanye West wasn't stopping until every person had a place to call home. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on Kanye West disguising himself as homeless to test the police? What do you expect will happen next? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.